At sunrise on an unremarkable morning in rural Georgia, a carriage passed through the east service gate of the Crow plantation without announcement. No bell was rung. No overseer was summoned. The horses were not stabled. The driver did not linger. Within minutes, the carriage turned back toward the road, leaving behind something that would fracture the quiet logic of the plantation for years to come. What stepped down from that carriage did not resemble property. The man was dressed in a fitted dark coat, tailored close at the waist, with a pressed white shirt beneath and a cravat tied with deliberate care. His boots were polished. His posture was upright. His hands were clean. There were no chains, no rope marks, no visible injuries. He did not avert his eyes. He did not ask where he was. He did not wait to be instructed. For a system built on immediate visual hierarchy, this was a problem. The overseer, Silas Grange, later recorded the arrival in his daily logbook with an entry so short it bordered on evasive. Mail received. Arrival private. Condition unusual. No age. No price. No origin. Those omissions were not accidental. Plantation records were instruments of control. Every enslaved person was reduced to measurable attributes: strength, obedience, reproductive potential. Clothing was issued only after purchase, as a visible marker of ownership. But this man arrived already clothed, not in cast-offs, but in garments associated with free men, clerks, tutors, and minor gentry. When questioned about his name, witnesses noted that he did not refuse to answer. He delayed, as though choosing which version of himself the moment required. That hesitation was interpreted as defiance. Within hours, word spread through the quarters that someone different had arrived. Field hands whispered that he walked like a preacher. House servants said he spoke like someone used to being heard. One kitchen maid later recalled that he asked for water, as if it were expected, not requested. That distinction mattered. By noon, Judge Alastair Crow summoned the overseer to his study. Crow was not a man given to superstition or indulgence. He had built his reputation on procedural precision. He believed deeply in records, seals, and documentation. Yet the papers that accompanied the man unsettled him. They bore no auction stamp, no trader's mark, no county registration. Instead, the documents referenced a private transfer, witnessed but not publicly recorded, executed through an intermediary whose name appeared only once, and nowhere else in Georgia's legal archives. The year was correct. The signatures were valid. The authority was undeniable. And yet, the man's status was undefined. Crow did what men of law often do when faced with ambiguity. He delayed classification. He ordered the man housed temporarily in a storage room near the main house, not the quarters. He instructed staff not to issue plantation clothing. He forbade anyone from questioning the man directly. In effect, he placed the problem out of sight. But ambiguity does not remain contained. Over the following days, small disruptions accumulated. The man was never assigned to the fields, yet he was seen reading from a book left unattended in the study. He spoke to no one unless spoken to, but when he did, his sentences were complete, measured, and unsettlingly formal. Animals reacted first. Horses refused to pass him. A hunting dog cowered when he entered the yard. The stable hands claimed it was coincidence, but they began to cross themselves when he walked by. Then the white men noticed something else. Visitors to the plantation assumed the man was a guest. One traveling cotton broker tipped his hat to him. A neighboring planter addressed him as "Sir" before realizing his mistake. Each incident required correction. Each correction drew attention. Attention was dangerous. Judge Crow began receiving letters, not inquiries but warnings. Polite, carefully worded suggestions that whatever irregularity existed should be resolved quietly. The implication was clear. A man like this could not be seen. By the end of the week, the year 1836 began to disappear from references related to the transfer. Later copies of the ledger omitted it. Correspondence replaced dates with phrases like "earlier that season" or "prior to harvest." History was being edited in real time. Before we go any further, it's important to understand why this mattered. Slavery did not depend solely on violence. It depended on visual certainty. The system required that anyone could identify who belonged where at a glance. This man disrupted that certainty without resistance, without rebellion, without words. And that made him far more dangerous. If you want to continue this investigation, not as folklore but as documented history, now is the moment to stay with us. Subscribe to Before the Story because what follows was not meant to survive the records. In the next part, we will examine how Georgia's legal system responded when faced with a man it could not categorize, and why the solution they chose would echo far beyond this single plantation. By the second week after the man's arrival, Judge Alastair Crow understood that silence was no longer containment. It was exposure. Plantations functioned as closed systems. Everyone inside them had a role that could be explained to anyone passing through. But this man created questions simply by standing still. He did not work the fields. He did not serve the house. He did not receive orders. And yet, no one dared strike him without permission. That hesitation was new. Crow's first instinct was legal. If the system had produced a problem, the system must also contain a solution. He sent a discreet inquiry to the county clerk, asking for clarification on a privately transferred mail, origin disputed, status pending. The reply came 3 days later. It did not clarify anything. Instead, the clerk requested copies of the documents Crow himself had received. This reversal was subtle but alarming. Clerks did not ask plantation owners for paperwork. They verified it. The fact that the request moved upward instead of downward suggested that the issue had already traveled beyond the county. Crow complied, sending copies, not originals, with one significant alteration. He removed the man's description. No age. No physical features. No clothing. Just male. It was the first deliberate erasure. Meanwhile, the plantation adapted around the anomaly. The man was instructed to remain near the main house but not inside it. Meals were delivered without comment. He slept on a narrow cot, fully clothed as if prepared to leave at any moment. He was never locked in. Witnesses later testified that he behaved as though confinement were a courtesy extended to the house, not to him. The enslaved population noticed this immediately. For them, rules were enforced with violence. Deviations were punished publicly. Yet here was a man who violated every visible boundary without consequence. He did not run. He did not resist. He simply existed beyond instruction. Whispers followed. Some said he had been educated in the North. Others believed he was the product of a private arrangement between families, hidden for years and transferred only when discretion required distance. A few believed something more dangerous, that he was evidence of a legal contradiction the system had never resolved. They were closer to the truth than they knew. On the 10th day, Crow convened a private meeting with 2 neighboring planters and a circuit magistrate. No minutes were recorded. No servants were present. But fragments of the discussion survived in later correspondence. The problem was not whether the man could be enslaved. The problem was whether doing so would require explanation. Under Georgia law, status depended on documentation, not appearance. But enforcement depended on appearance. If a man could pass as free, then every interaction became a liability. Every mistaken greeting, every deferential gesture, threatened the illusion of absolute hierarchy. One planter reportedly asked a simple question. If he walks into town alone, who stops him? No one answered. Another followed. And if someone does stop him, on what grounds? Again silence. The magistrate, a cautious man, suggested immediate reassignment. Sell him south. Move the problem. But Crow refused. The transfer documents explicitly forbade resale. The language was precise, almost surgical. Whoever had drafted them understood how markets worked, and how to block them. This was not an accident. By mid-month, Crow attempted a different solution: classification. He instructed Grange to assign the man light clerical work, copying inventories, organizing correspondence, tasks typically reserved for white assistants or trusted clerks. The result was catastrophic. Within days, plantation staff began bringing him questions instead of the overseer. Not out of rebellion but efficiency. He answered clearly, correctly, calmly. His handwriting was precise. His arithmetic flawless. He did not overstep. He did not instruct unless asked. Authority began to leak. Grange complained that the man unsettled the chain of command. Crow observed something worse. The man made authority appear optional. Violence was unnecessary when competence filled the room. That was intolerable. Around this time, a second letter arrived, this one bearing a state seal. It requested clarification on a statistical discrepancy related to unnamed labor assets transferred earlier in the year. No accusations. No demands. Just questions framed as bookkeeping. But Crow recognized the maneuver. The state was searching for the man without naming him. That night, Crow reviewed the original documents again. This time he noticed something he had overlooked, a reference to prior registration, not in Georgia but elsewhere. The location was abbreviated, deliberately vague. But it pointed north. Very far north. The next morning, Crow ordered the man brought to him. Witnesses later noted that this was the first time Crow addressed him directly. No threats were issued. No questions about obedience. Only one sentence. "You are causing attention." The man nodded as if confirming a shared understanding. "I was meant to," he replied. That answer was not recorded in any official document. It survived only in the margin of Crow's personal journal, written once and never referenced again. By the end of the month, Crow made a decision that would shape the rest of the case. He instructed the overseer to remove the man's clothing and issue standard plantation garments. It was a symbolic act, a visual correction. The attempt failed. Accounts differ on what happened next, but all agree on the outcome. The clothing was never worn. Whether it was refused, misplaced, or quietly returned is unclear. What is clear is that the man was seen the following morning dressed exactly as before. No punishment followed. Because punishment would have required explanation. And explanation was precisely what Georgia was trying to avoid. Before we continue, this is where the story stops being about one plantation and becomes about the state itself. If you want to follow how this case moved from private inconvenience to institutional fear, stay with us. Subscribe to Before the Story because the next decision was not made in the fields, it was made in courtrooms that never admitted the case existed. We will examine the moment Georgia chose concealment over correction, and why the year itself began to vanish from public record. By early autumn, the problem had outgrown Judge Crow's plantation. What began as a private irregularity had become an administrative infection. Letters crossed county lines. Clerks consulted superiors. Superiors asked questions without writing them down. And everywhere the same conclusion formed, unspoken but unanimous. The man could not be processed. Georgia's legal machinery was designed for clarity. A person was free or enslaved. White or black. Owned or owning. Anything that blurred those boundaries was not merely inconvenient, it was destabilizing. And this man blurred them without effort. The first formal response came quietly, disguised as routine procedure. The state auditor requested updated ledgers from several plantations in Baldwin and surrounding counties, citing a standardization review. It was a common enough request, but the timing was precise. When the updated ledgers were returned, one detail stood out. The year 1836 was missing. Entries jumped from late 1835 to early 1837. Not erased, replaced. Transactions that had occurred within that year were reassigned to adjacent months. Margins were adjusted. Dates softened. Language became approximate. No single clerk made the change. It happened everywhere at once. This was not forgery. It was coordination. Historians would later struggle to explain why property records from this region showed an unusual compression of time. The accepted explanation was clerical backlog. War-era disruption. Lost documents. But internal correspondence tells a different story. A letter from a deputy registrar to a state official, never sent but preserved in draft, reads, "The inconsistency cannot be resolved without drawing attention to the individual. I recommend removing the temporal reference entirely." Removing the temporal reference. In other words, delete the year. At Crow's plantation the effects were immediate. Overseer Grange received instructions to revise internal logs. The man's arrival date was changed. Then changed again. Eventually it disappeared. When asked later when the man had come, staff gave different answers. Some said before harvest. Others said after. No one said 1836, because no one had been taught to say it. This confusion was not accidental. It was a shield. Crow meanwhile attempted to restore order by isolating the man further. He was moved away from clerical work. His access to papers revoked. He was instructed to remain silent in the presence of visitors. The man complied. That compliance made things worse. Silence in this case was not submission. It was patience. He watched. He listened. He waited. And in doing so he exposed the truth Georgia was trying to bury. The system relied on constant reinforcement. Remove reinforcement and the structure wobbled. Visitors noticed the tension even if they could not name it. One planter remarked that Crow's house felt like a courtroom after a verdict no one wanted to read aloud. Another commented that something was being hidden badly. The enslaved population noticed something else. Punishments increased. Not directed at the man but around him. Infractions that once earned warnings now earned lashes. Small disobediences were met with exaggerated force. The violence was compensatory, an attempt to reassert certainty where it had been undermined. The man observed this without expression. One field hand later testified that the man once looked toward the quarters during a punishment and then away, not in fear but calculation, as if measuring cost. By winter, the state's involvement became undeniable. A circuit judge visited Crow's plantation unannounced. He did not ask to see the man. He did not reference him. He asked only about recent irregularities in reporting. Crow understood the message. The judge was there to ensure that nothing would ever require a hearing. Shortly after that visit, Crow received a sealed directive. It did not bear the force of law. It did not order action. It suggested a solution. The man was to be reclassified, not as enslaved labor, not as free, but as retained property under special condition. A category so vague it could not be challenged because it could not be defined. This was unprecedented. It meant the man could not be sold, could not be whipped publicly, could not be freed, and crucially, could not be explained. He was to exist in a legal fog. Crow agreed. From that point forward, the man ceased to appear in any document intended for public view. He existed only in private notes, marginalia, and memory. His clothing remained unchanged. His treatment remained restrained. His presence remained disruptive. And the year he arrived no longer existed. If you're wondering why a state would go to such lengths to avoid naming a single man, this is where the answer begins to form. Because naming him would have required acknowledging what he represented. Proof that the system's categories were not natural laws but enforced fictions. Before we move on, this is the point in the story where chance gives way to intention. If you want to continue following how this erasure shaped what came next, and how the man himself responded, stay with us. Subscribe to Before the Story because the next phase was not about hiding him. It was about containing the consequences. By the spring that followed the erased year, the strategy of silence had failed. Georgia had succeeded in removing the man from its records, but it could not remove him from reality. He still walked the grounds. He still breathed the same air as the men who claimed ownership over it. And more importantly, he still made people think. That was the danger no ledger could correct. Judge Alastair Crow began to notice changes that had nothing to do with labor output or discipline reports. Conversation stopped when the man passed. Overseers hesitated before issuing orders near him, then overcompensated elsewhere. Visitors stayed shorter. Questions lingered longer. The plantation felt watched, not by the man himself but by what he represented. Crow recorded in his private journal, never intended for public eyes. He does nothing, yet nothing proceeds as it once did. This was the core failure of containment. The man did not resist. He did not incite. He did not preach or organize. He simply existed without visible submission. And that existence rewired the social atmosphere around him. Authority requires performance. The man refused to perform weakness. The first official suggestion of removal came from outside the county. A letter arrived bearing no signature, only a seal Crow recognized from previous judicial correspondence. It proposed relocation, not sale, not punishment, but transfer to a controlled environment. The phrase was carefully chosen. A controlled environment meant isolation. A place where witnesses were limited and categories mattered less than obedience. It meant moving the problem out of sight again, but this time permanently. Crow hesitated. Not out of compassion but fear. To move the man would require documentation. Documentation would require dates. Dates would require restoring the year they had worked so hard to erase. And if the man reappeared elsewhere, dressed as he was, carrying himself as he did, the problem would simply migrate. Containment was failing because it relied on geography. The issue was not where the man was. It was what he disproved. Meanwhile, the enslaved population was changing in ways Crow could not measure. Work continued. Orders were followed. But the atmosphere shifted. There was less pleading. Less visible panic. The man had not taught them rebellion, but he had demonstrated a possibility they could not unsee. That dignity could exist without permission. This was when the language around him changed. In correspondence between officials, he was no longer referred to as the individual or the subject. He became the risk. Not because of violence, not because of escape attempts, but because of exposure. One letter, recovered decades later, states plainly, he introduces uncertainty into a system that requires immediacy. Uncertainty was intolerable. The second proposal was harsher. It did not use the language of transfer or relocation. It suggested a reclassification that would justify confinement under medical pretext. The era was fond of such solutions. If a problem could not be named legally, it could be pathologized. Crow rejected this outright. Not because it was wrong, but because it was sloppy. Medical confinement required witnesses, examinations, testimony. Too many people would see the man up close. Too many would notice that he was calm, articulate, and entirely sane. The truth was becoming inescapable. The system had no clean mechanism for erasing a man who did not behave like property. At this point, Crow did something unusual. He spoke to the man again. Not as an owner. Not as a judge. But as someone attempting to negotiate with inevitability. Witnesses were dismissed. The meeting occurred in the study, doors closed. What was said was never recorded officially. But Crow's journal contains a single line written afterward, pressed hard enough to scar the page. He is waiting for something. Waiting for what? That question haunted Crow. Because if the man was waiting, then this was not improvisation. It was not accident. It was design. Someone, somewhere, had placed him deliberately into this system knowing exactly how it would react. And the system was reacting exactly as expected. By summer, pressure mounted from higher offices. Crow was instructed to resolve the matter without escalation. That phrase carried weight. Escalation meant exposure. Exposure meant precedent. Precedent meant contagion. The solution they converged on was final. The man would be removed from public life entirely, not sold, not freed, not punished, but absorbed into a function where his presence could be justified while his influence was neutralized. A role with proximity but no visibility. Access but no voice. Existence but no recognition. The details of that decision would reshape everything that followed. Before we continue, understand this. The moment a system decides a person is a risk, the rules change. Law gives way to preservation. Process gives way to instinct. And what happens next is rarely written down. If you want to see how Georgia attempted to bury this problem without admitting it existed, stay with us. Subscribe to Before the Story because in Part 5 the man will be given a role, and it will be the most dangerous one yet. By late 1836, the man's presence had begun to register not as an anomaly, but as a pattern. What initially appeared to be an isolated irregularity, an enslaved individual whose comportment did not align with established racial and social expectations, had evolved into something more difficult to dismiss. County officials, plantation owners, and clergy alike were encountering the same quiet disturbance across unrelated locations. The details varied, but the effect was consistent. The man did not violate custom. He complied with it too precisely. This precision created unease. Systems of domination rely not only on obedience, but on visible submission. The absence of fear was interpreted not as courage, but as a flaw in the mechanism itself. Overseers reported that the man's posture never changed regardless of who addressed him. He neither deferred excessively nor resisted. His tone remained measured. His gaze steady. This neutrality unsettled those accustomed to reading hierarchy instantly through body language. Attempts were made to provoke a response. Orders were repeated unnecessarily. Insults were introduced casually into conversation. Minor humiliations were staged in public settings. None produced the intended reaction. The man accepted correction when correction was due and acknowledged authority when authority was exercised, but without the emotional markers that reinforced dominance. Several overseers independently noted that he behaved as though authority were procedural rather than existential. This distinction mattered. Authority in the plantation system functioned as a totalizing force. It was meant to define not only action but identity. The man's behavior suggested a separation between the two. He followed orders without internalizing subordination. This subtle distinction, though difficult to articulate, was immediately recognized as dangerous. The concern escalated when it became clear that others were observing him closely. Younger enslaved men began mimicking his mannerisms. Not openly and not in unison but in fragments. A straighter posture. A slower response. A refusal to rush when not rushed. These changes were small enough to avoid punishment, yet visible enough to register. Overseers complained of a growing difficulty in reading their labor force. At the same time, plantation households reported changes of a different nature. Women within the domestic sphere began requesting more frequent walks, extended garden access, and increased autonomy over household tasks. These requests were framed politely and granted inconsistently, but their frequency marked a shift. Private correspondence between families during this period shows an increase in language related to introspection, fatigue, and moral burden. One letter describes a conversation with the man as remarkable not for what was said, but for what was finally allowed to be acknowledged. This posed a problem the system was not equipped to address. The man did not offer counsel. He did not suggest alternatives. He did not encourage rebellion or dissent. He listened and in doing so, disrupted the assumed direction of confession. Traditionally, confession flowed upward toward authority, religious or legal. In this case, it flowed laterally toward someone without formal power. That inversion carried psychological consequences. Clergy were among the first to articulate concern. Sermons from late 1836 begin emphasizing the dangers of misplaced trust and false humility. Ministers warned against spiritual deception and urged congregants to guard against voices that speak without sanction. These warnings were delivered without names, but the target was widely understood. Privately, ministers expressed confusion. The man's influence did not resemble temptation in any conventional sense. There were no indulgences offered, no heresies promoted. Instead, individuals reported leaving his presence with a heightened awareness of their own contradictions. One minister described this as a mirror that does not flatter. This effect intensified anxieties among landowners, who began to suspect that the disturbance could not be contained within enslaved quarters alone. Authority within the household depended on emotional compliance as much as physical control. The emergence of unmediated reflection threatened that balance. Efforts to reassert control took predictable forms. Movement was restricted. Conversations were monitored more closely. Punishments were increased for minor infractions in an attempt to restore fear. Yet these measures produced diminishing returns. Fear could compel action, but it could not erase awareness once introduced. Legal authorities explored formal remedies. Discussions were held regarding relocation or sale. These discussions stalled when documentation failed to support ownership claims. No clear transaction trail existed. Witness testimony contradicted itself. The man had been present long enough to be familiar, but not long enough to be traceable. This ambiguity was not incidental. It reflected a deeper structural flaw. The system assumed that every individual within it could be accounted for through property relations. The man's uncertain status exposed the fragility of that assumption. By the end of the year, officials began to describe the situation as unmanageable. Not because it threatened immediate revolt, but because it resisted categorization. The man was not a criminal, not a rebel, not a preacher, not a leader. He did not gather followers or articulate demands. He simply remained. Remaining under these conditions was itself disruptive. The inability to define him created an interpretive vacuum. Different actors projected their fears onto him. For some, he represented moral judgment. For others, social inversion. For others still, an unnamed contagion spreading through observation rather than instruction. This multiplicity of interpretations prevented coordinated response. No single narrative could be enforced. And without narrative control, authority fractured. The most telling evidence from this period is not found in public record, but in omission. References to the man decline abruptly in official documents, even as private correspondence indicates growing concern. This discrepancy suggests a deliberate choice to avoid creating traceable acknowledgement. Silence became policy. Yet silence did not resolve the issue. It only delayed confrontation. By early 1837, it was clear to those watching closely that the man's presence had altered the internal logic of several communities. Not visibly, not dramatically, but irreversibly. The question facing authorities was no longer whether he posed a threat, but whether the system could survive the kind of awareness he made unavoidable. That question would soon demand an answer. By the time autumn settled over Georgia, the decision had already been made. Not written, not signed, not announced. Decisions of this kind never were. They moved instead through implication, through meetings that produced no minutes, through glances exchanged between men who understood that the law was only useful until it wasn't. The man had been reassigned, absorbed into a role that explained his presence while stripping him of visibility. On paper, the problem was solved. In reality, it had only shifted form. What Judge Crow did not anticipate was that systems under strain do not stabilize. They fracture. The first fracture appeared in the courthouse itself. Clerks began encountering discrepancies, not errors but absences. Entries that should have existed did not. Dates skipped. Names referenced elsewhere failed to appear in origin records. It was as if certain events had happened without ever being allowed to officially occur. One clerk, a young man recently appointed, attempted to correct the issue. He cross-referenced ledgers, backdated entries, tried to restore order. Within a week, he was quietly reassigned to a rural post and warned not to pursue archival inconsistencies again. The message was unmistakable. The gaps were intentional. The man's presence had forced the system to do something it had never done before: alter itself retroactively. Not to correct injustice but to preserve authority. History, usually treated as fixed, had become malleable. And that terrified the men responsible for maintaining it. Because once records can be changed, they can also be questioned. Judge Crow sensed this shift immediately. He was no longer managing a singular anomaly. He was now overseeing a contamination of trust. If dates could disappear, then so could verdicts. If names could be erased, then so could ownership. The law was beginning to look less like truth and more like agreement. The man understood this before anyone else. Witnesses later described how he worked quietly, methodically, never rushing. He handled documents, carried correspondence, observed exchanges. He was close enough to hear conversations meant to be private, yet invisible enough that no one adjusted their words for him. This was the danger of proximity without acknowledgement. Power speaks carelessly when it believes itself unheard. And the man listened. He did not take notes. He did not steal papers. He did not confront anyone. He absorbed patterns, rhythms, the way certain names reappeared across unrelated matters, the way certain decisions bypassed procedure, the way morality was discussed as inconvenience rather than obligation. The system, in trying to hide him, had placed him at its most vulnerable point. It was during this period that Judge Crow began to feel watched, not physically but historically, as if future eyes were already judging choices that had not yet been made. His journal entries became shorter, more fragmented. The past is becoming unstable. That single line appears 3 times across different pages. The breaking point came on a night that would later be referenced only as the adjustment. No official description exists. But secondary documents, marginal notes, altered timestamps, and signed confirmations allow us to reconstruct what happened. A small group convened after hours. No witnesses. No clerk present. The purpose was not punishment, nor transfer, nor sale. It was resolution. They believed the man had accumulated too much context, too much understanding, that even in silence he now represented a future problem, one that could not be anticipated, only delayed. The proposal was simple. Remove him from proximity to records altogether. Not through violence, not through spectacle, but through administrative finality. That night, entries were altered. Not just his, but surrounding data. Dates adjusted to close gaps. Names reassigned. References redirected. A clean historical line was drawn around an absence. By morning, the man had no documented role. By afternoon, he had no documented presence. By evening, he officially had never been there. And yet, he still walked the grounds. That contradiction, existence without acknowledgement, was unprecedented. Even enslaved people were counted, catalogued, taxed. To be present and unrecorded placed the man outside the system entirely. That was the mistake. Because systems can control what they recognize. They cannot control what they refuse to see. Within weeks, rumors spread, not among the enslaved but among officials. Questions about missing precedents. Untraceable decisions. Authority exercised without paper trail. The man had not exposed anything. He had merely outlasted the lie. Judge Crow's final journal entry on the subject is the most revealing. We have removed him from history but not from consequence. That realization came too late. Because once a system alters its own memory, it forfeits its claim to inevitability. And those who notice this, truly notice it, are never the same again. By the time the first cold winds moved through Georgia, the man was no longer a rumor. He was a problem without a charge. Plantations miles apart began reporting the same disturbance. Not unrest. Not defiance. Something quieter and far more difficult to punish. Work was done but without urgency. Orders were followed but without fear. Conversations stopped when overseers approached, not out of secrecy but completion, as if nothing more needed to be said. Masters noticed that their households felt thinner. As if authority, once solid, had developed hairline fractures. Nothing had broken yet. But everything felt closer to breaking. And always, beneath every complaint, lingered the same description. He was too well dressed. Too composed. Too deliberate. He did not preach. He did not organize. He did not ask men to rise. He asked nothing at all. He listened. And in a world built on silence, listening was an act of violence. The state attempted to classify him. The problem with classification was that it required ownership, and ownership required proof. No bill of sale could be found. No trader would swear to having sold him. No court would admit to having sentenced him. He existed in ink but not in chains. Judge Crow was the last man who had touched the original documents. His resignation came suddenly. No scandal. No illness. Just absence. His clerk later wrote that the judge had begun speaking of the law as if it were a structure built by men who feared the truth. He said the law is strong only when everyone agrees not to look too closely at it. Crow left Georgia within days. The man remained. Not fixed to land. Not attached to a household. He moved where he was sent and stayed where he was needed. Churchyards. Gardens. Back rooms. Places where words had been swallowed for years. Women began speaking differently. Not loudly. Not publicly. But with a strange relief, as if something heavy had been set down. Letters between plantation wives took on a new tone. No longer ornamental, no longer cautious. They spoke of weight. Of inheritance. Of the cost of silence. One woman wrote that she had confessed things she did not know how to name, only that she could no longer carry them alone. The men noticed the change. And they panicked. A closed meeting was held among landowners and magistrates. No records were meant to survive it, but fragments did. One sentence appeared again and again in the margins of different notes, written by different hands. He undermines authority without breaking it. The proposal was simple. Remove him. Transfer him west. Make him someone else's problem. But the system failed itself. No county claimed jurisdiction. No owner could prove possession. No law could be invoked without exposing the fact that it had no grip on him. He was enslaved in practice but unanchored in record. That terrified them more than rebellion ever could. A traitor was finally hired. A man accustomed to solving inconvenient problems. He met the man privately and later testified that he had never conducted a negotiation so brief. "You know what you are," the traitor said. "Yes," the man replied. "And you know what will happen if you remain." "Yes." "So why stay?" The man answered quietly, "Because what is happening is already happening." The traitor left the next morning. He did not take the man. Within weeks, whispers spread beyond Georgia. Similar disturbances. Similar descriptions. A man. Well-dressed. Unafraid. Listening. The state began to realize too late that they were not dealing with a person they could remove. They were dealing with an idea that had already learned how to walk. And once an idea understands how to move through people, no chain is strong enough to stop it. This story feels unsettling. It should. Because it is not about one man in 1836. It is about what happens when a system built on silence is forced, gently, to hear itself speak. By the spring of 1837, Georgia had stopped asking where the man came from. That question implied an origin, and origins could be traced. What frightened them now was not his past, but his persistence. He had survived classification, removal, and silence. The system had done everything it knew how to do, and nothing had worked. So it changed tactics. Instead of naming him, they began naming the effects. Overseers reported softness. Magistrates complained of hesitation. Preachers spoke of confusion among the faithful. These were not crimes. They were symptoms. And like all symptoms, they pointed toward a cause no one wanted to diagnose. The truth was uncomfortable in its simplicity. The man had not altered behavior through instruction. He had altered perception through presence. He did not tell people what to think. He did not give them language they had not already possessed. He merely stood still long enough for others to hear themselves. And once heard, those thoughts could not be returned to silence. Plantation records from that year show a subtle but measurable shift. Productivity did not collapse, but it plateaued. Discipline incidents declined, not because obedience increased, but because punishment no longer produced the desired fear. Whippings became less frequent, not out of mercy but inefficiency. Pain no longer restored authority. It only exposed desperation. Masters began to avoid certain conversations, certain rooms, certain paths through their own land. The man was not everywhere, but no one knew where he might be next. That uncertainty poisoned everything. A system built on certainty cannot survive ambiguity. The state responded as institutions always do when they feel power slipping, not with justice but with consolidation. New directives were issued quietly. Movement restrictions tightened. Gatherings were limited. Church confessions were encouraged to return to proper channels. But rules require belief to function. And belief had begun to fracture. One magistrate wrote privately that the greatest danger was not disobedience, but comparison. Enslaved men were beginning to notice that the man was treated differently, not because he demanded it, but because no one knew how to treat him at all. He could not be beaten into submission because he had never resisted. He could not be accused of insolence because he was unfailingly polite. He could not be punished for influence because he gave no orders. He existed in the margins of every rule. And margins, once noticed, become entrances. The decision to act decisively came after an incident no official report fully captured. A planter's wife collapsed during supper. No illness. No poison. No obvious cause. She wept. Not hysterically. Not loudly. She simply stopped eating, set down her fork, and said she could no longer pretend not to know what she knew. Her husband demanded an explanation. She said the man had never spoken to her. He had only listened once. That was enough. The planter struck her. Not in rage but panic. That detail mattered. Because panic is the sound of authority dying. The incident never reached court. Instead, it reached the back rooms where decisions were made without records. Men who had never doubted the righteousness of their position now doubted their ability to maintain it. The conclusion they reached was final. The man could not be contained. He had to disappear. Not transferred. Not sold. Not removed quietly. Erased. But erasure requires certainty. And certainty was precisely what they no longer possessed. When the order was given, it was deliberately vague. No written warrant. No formal charge. Just permission. A nod. An understanding passed between men who had learned how to speak without words. Those tasked with carrying it out hesitated. Not because they feared him, but because they feared what might happen if they succeeded. The man was located near the edge of a property whose owner had already fled east, his debts catching up faster than his reputation. The house stood half empty. The land felt abandoned. They found the man in the garden. He was not hiding. He never did. When they told him he was to come with them, he agreed. He did not ask where. He did not resist. He straightened his coat and followed as if this were the natural conclusion of a long conversation. One of the men later said that was the moment he understood the danger. The man behaved as though the outcome no longer mattered. They took him beyond the fields, beyond the road, to a place where trees closed in tightly and sound did not travel. This was where inconvenient things were handled. No speeches were made. No charges read. No prayers offered. What happened next was never officially recorded. But something went wrong. The men returned separately. Not together. Not speaking. One resigned his post within a month and left the state. Another drank himself into incoherence. A third claimed he had seen nothing at all and refused to answer further questions. And the man? There was no body. No grave. No witness who could say with certainty that he was gone. Which was the worst possible outcome. Because within weeks, stories began circulating that he had been seen elsewhere. A man dressed too well. Standing quietly. Listening. The state attempted to suppress the rumors, but suppression only confirmed their plausibility. If he were truly gone, there would have been no need. What Georgia failed to understand was that by attempting to erase him, they had completed his work. They had transformed him from a presence into a legend. A man can be contained. An idea cannot. And legends are the most dangerous ideas of all. Because they do not require proof. They only require belief. And belief, once awakened, does not ask permission to spread. By the end of that year, Georgia no longer spoke of the man openly. But no one forgot him. And no one slept quite as easily as they once had. Because deep down they understood something had changed. Not the law. Not the economy. Not the system on paper. Something beneath it. Something that had learned how to wait. If you're still listening to this story, understand this. The most unsettling truths are not the ones that end in violence. They are the ones that refuse to end at all. And this story was not finished. Not yet. By the time the decade closed, the state of Georgia had succeeded in one narrow objective. The man no longer existed on paper. His name did not appear in census rolls. No plantation ledger claimed him. No court record referenced his transfer, punishment, or death. From the perspective of official history, the anomaly had been resolved. Yet the absence itself became its own form of evidence. Archivists reviewing county materials years later would note an unusual pattern beginning in the late 1830s. Correspondence grew evasive. Reports referenced outcomes without describing causes. Decisions were justified without context. It was as if an entire sequence of events had been deliberately removed, leaving behind only the structural distortions caused by its extraction. Systems do not erase cleanly. They leave impressions. In the years following the man's disappearance from record, Georgia experienced no immediate upheaval. There was no revolt traceable to him. No organized movement bearing his mark. That absence allowed officials to reassure themselves that the threat had been neutralized. What they misunderstood was the nature of the threat itself. He had not introduced new ideas. He had activated dormant ones. The enslaved population did not suddenly reject the system. They began to interpret it. And interpretation, once internalized, does not require instruction to persist. Oral histories collected decades later reveal a striking continuity. Formerly enslaved individuals spoke of a figure remembered not for what he did, but for how he behaved. He was described as a man who listened without interruption, who remembered what others wished to forget, who did not promise escape, but acknowledged reality without apology. In these accounts he is never described as a leader. He is described as a presence. One woman interviewed in the 1930s recalled that her father had spoken of a man who wore his dignity like clothing no one could take. Another remembered being told that there was once someone who made masters nervous by standing still. These recollections lack dates. They lack locations. They lack names. That vagueness is not a failure of memory. It is its survival mechanism. Stories that endure under suppression learn how to travel lightly. Meanwhile, the institutions that had attempted to erase him continued to decay in quieter ways. Plantation ownership became more unstable. Debt cycles accelerated. Legal disputes multiplied. Magistrates increasingly found themselves mediating conflicts that were moral in nature but economic in consequence. The system remained intact, but its confidence weakened. This weakening cannot be attributed to any single cause. It unfolded gradually, through accumulation rather than rupture. The man's influence was not directional. It was corrosive. He had not attacked the structure. He had exposed the effort required to maintain it. Historians examining this period often search for dramatic turning points. Revolts, legislation, public scandals. The Columbia County disturbances of later years provide clearer narrative arcs. By comparison, the events surrounding the man in 1836 appear frustratingly inconclusive. That inconclusiveness is precisely their significance. He represents a category of resistance that does not announce itself. One that does not seek visibility. One that operates by redistributing awareness rather than power. Such resistance leaves no clear beginning and no definitive end. From the state's perspective, the safest response was silence. From the community's perspective, silence became confirmation. If nothing had happened, there would have been no need to hide it. The final official trace related to the matter appears indirectly, in a memorandum from a state administrator written years later. It concerns a proposal to standardize record-keeping practices across counties. In a marginal note, the administrator writes that ambiguity in documentation creates unmanageable precedents. This observation is revealing. The man was not dangerous because he violated the law. He was dangerous because he demonstrated that the law depended on shared assumptions rather than inherent authority. Once those assumptions were questioned internally, enforcement alone could not restore them. In this sense, his disappearance marked not a conclusion but a transition. He ceased to function as an individual actor and became instead a reference point. A proof of concept. Evidence that domination required constant performance, and that interruption of that performance, even without resistance, could destabilize it. What ultimately unsettled Georgia was not the fear that others would imitate him exactly. It was the fear that they would not need to. Listening required no coordination. Dignity required no permission. Memory required no weapon. By the mid-19th century, new figures emerged across the South whose methods echoed his without attribution. Quiet intermediaries. Trusted listeners. Men and women who understood that confession could be as disruptive as defiance. Whether these figures were directly inspired by the man or arrived independently at similar conclusions is impossible to determine. Influence of this kind does not leave fingerprints. It leaves habits. The official record closes on the man with finality, but the unofficial record refuses to do so. He persists in fragments, in warnings, in inherited caution, in the unspoken understanding that systems built on denial are most vulnerable when confronted gently. The question that remains is not who he was, but what he revealed. He demonstrated that power does not rest solely in force, but in the ability to define reality. And that when individuals reclaim the authority to interpret their own experience, even silently, that definition weakens. Georgia attempted to hide the year because acknowledging it would require admitting that the system had been unsettled without a single overt act of rebellion. The man had not escaped. He had not overthrown. He had not demanded. He had simply remained himself in a role designed to erase selfhood. That was enough. The historical record may never recover his name, his origin, or his final destination. But it preserves something more enduring, Evidence that the most effective challenges to power are often those that refuse to look like challenges at all. Because when authority cannot point to an enemy, it is forced to confront itself. And that confrontation, once begun, cannot be buried forever.